Here I am with the leg, with all of the high spots in the leg cut down to their final dimension. Now, before I proceed, I want to take my spindle gouge and mill the high spots, like hog out all the material from high spot to high spot. Okay, and after that I can proceed. Now that I have a smooth line from high spot to high spot along the leg, I can take my template and transfer all of the low spots and the edges of the beads onto the leg. There we go. So now I have the low spots roughed out, so that leaves me to do the beadwork on either side of the low spots. For that, I'm going to use the skew chisel. Now the skew chisel is the toughest chisel to master. In the right hands, the skew, you could just about do the whole thing with a skew chisel if you know what you're doing. For the rest of us, the pitfalls with a skew chisel is that if you're cutting along and you catch it with either the tip or the heel of it, it's going to dig in and spiral out, and it'll give you a big kick, and it's jarring when it happens, and it often ruins your piece. It'll take a great big gouge out of it that's tough to fix, which doesn't put you in a good mood. So I do as little as I can with a skew chisel, and I'll show you the easy way to work with it. Basically, this is the site of one of the beads, and on either side of the high spot, we're going to use the tip of it upside down like this. We're going to dig in and then cut in from either side. And it's not that hard to do it this way, so here we go. Now that I'm at this point, I'm going to use a fine spoke shave to round off the beads and to make these transitions a little more elegant. You can do that with the skew chisel. I minimize my use of the skew chisel as much as I can. Now back to the skew chisel to get the last bit of detail done. Notice how here I'm using the skew chisel as a scraper just about. I'm holding it flat to the surface, and you can do it that way. Makes it harder to make a mistake. So when you're sanding this at high speed, you can use your sandpaper to sculpt this a little bit more, you know, make those transitions a little more defined, get the last bit of scoop out of there. At least with the sandpaper, you can't scuff it or gouge it, you know, it's very gradual, so it's harder to make a mistake. So once you get it close to your final shape, you're going to want to use your skew chisel to smooth it down and take the last bit of material off, because your skew chisel will get it really nice and smooth, minimize your sanding. You are eyeballing your last shape. You know, you can look at your template, but the idea is to have a convex surface here and slightly concave once you get down to this end. That's pretty close right there. So I'm getting pretty close to done this leg. You gotta do the same for the tip of it here. I'll show you that. The tip is rough, and I gotta use the skew to smooth that out and give it the final shape to the foot of it. You know, the skill involved with running a lathe is being able to replicate the same piece over and over and have them match pretty closely to each other. When I was first given this lathe, my dad gave me this lathe 2-3 years ago, and the very first project I tackled was to put a front railing on my porch. I had to turn 32 spindles for that front porch, and my dad thought I was nuts to do that for the first thing with a lathe, but I thought, hey, this project will make a turner out of me. It'll make a lathe man out of me, you know. And I did it. It took a very long time, but by the time I was done, I knew how to use a chisel. I don't think I would have achieved that had I had just done a little bit here and a little bit there, you know. So this part is going to be the tenon that goes into the seat bottom, and we can't yet mill this down to its final dimension. This is green wood. It's going to shrink on us, so we want to get it fairly close to the final dimension, and then there's things we're going to do to dry this and shrink it down before we give it its final turning. So now we're going to do our final sanding. I got the lathe set to a nice high speed. I got 80 grit sandpaper. Comes in these big coils. You got these strips. You take your tool rest and move it right out of the way. We don't want this getting in our way. And then one of the best pieces of advice I got from a master woodworker was when you're sanding, you start with your coarse and you move your way through the grades to the fine. You start with 80, go to 100, go to 150, and on down to about 220. Since I took that advice, I stopped having problems with the finish of my pieces. When you're doing the 80 grit, you can do any last little bit of shaping that you want to do on this. You know, it's coarse enough that it'll remove material and give you the curves and the shapes that you're seeking to get. You might have noticed I spent a little extra time over here. I wanted to give it more of a taper. It affords you the ability to do that. Before you move on to your next grade of sandpaper, just kind of look it over and make sure that you're getting that shape that you're shooting for. Because the coarse grade will take off some material. The finer grades, all they do is kind of smooth over the surface. So this is a little trick I figured out last winter. When you have your leg made, you want to dry the tenon but not the rest of it, because as it dries, if you were to dry the whole thing, it might warp slightly. It'll give you problems when you put it back on the lathe for the final sizing of the tenon. So I just lay it across the register for my heating, and that hot air blows across the tenon, and I rotate it every day or so, and that'll get it where I need to be to size it. Worked for me once, so it'll work for me again.